Welcome to Hemispheres. I'm Harv Bishop with co-host Richard Curtis. Tonight, questions about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process since the June Israeli election of the new government of Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu. Netanyahu's campaign equated Israeli security with a skeptical, cautious approach to the peace process. But in his first weeks in office, including last week's visit to the United States, Netanyahu sent mixed signals about his approach to peace. On this edition of Hemispheres, we'll sort through the uncertainty in a conversation with Palestinian scholar and peace activist Professor Amin Kazak. Amin is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he has co-taught a popular course on the Arab-Israeli peace process with an Israeli-American professor, Reuben Meller. Amin studied at the American University in Beirut, Lebanon, the University of Denver, and he is a research fellow at the Fourth World Center for the Study of Indigenous Law and Politics at University Colorado, Denver, and also at the Center for Conflict Resolution Consortium in Boulder. He is executive director of the Colorado Committee on U.S.-Arab Relations. Welcome, Amin.
Hi, Harvey.
I should note that tonight Hemispheres is on tape to accommodate Professor Kazak's schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd like to start by asking just exactly what we're to make of Netanyahu in these early days. There seems to be two perceptions. One, that he's a pragmatic politician who will talk tough while making peace, or are we to see him as a dogmatic ideologue who might provoke and worsen tensions?
Well, there are so much attention, especially in the media here, to give us like some kind of mixed signals about Netanyahu. But in general, Mr. Netanyahu is actually a kind of pragmatic Israeli leader. And should we understand that he spent most of his time as a student here in the United States and has been influenced with the pragmatism of the American politics, and maybe this is something that the audience or the readers of the media, they did not understand about it, and we have to separate the guy, Mr. Netanyahu, from his pragmatism and his dogma as being hawkish during the election. But I have a sense that Mr. Netanyahu is one of those politicians that he might make some consensus and maybe persuade the government of the Israeli government to make some consensus with the Palestinian. But we should not actually made so much of be optimistic about it, because Mr. Netanyahu is the kind of politicians that you have to read in between the lines of his statements sometimes, and you have to be very careful to make any kind of assessment about Mr. Netanyahu.
So then your sense is that you're still somewhat optimistic, but we're going to have to take a wait-and-see approach?
I believe that so, Harvey. That is, we have to wait a little bit, not to jump onto the wagon and make some conclusion at the beginning. And we have, to assess the process later on. Before making any kind of judgment and making any kind of statement that some people will think, well, this is the end of or the signal of the peace process dying and whatever. So though I am optimistic at the same time as a little bit cautious about it, or you can say a very cautious optimistic about Mr. Netanyahu and the Israeli government's policy today.
What's your assessment of the Israeli electorate? It's my understanding that approximately 70% of the Israelis still support the peace process. There are some who argue that this election was not so much a referendum on peace itself, but the approach that should be taken to peace.
Well, I believe that's the second part of what you said, Harvey, is the correct thing, is that it's the approach to the peace process that was missed by Mr. Perez. Because the peoples in the Middle East, whether you're talking about the Israeli or whether you're talking about the Palestinian, they are actually, they want some kind of situation that they could live in peace in mind and get along with their living. And so it's not that kind of issue that we are looking at the electorate, that they are responding to elect Netanyahu as rejecting the peace process. That's not true. It's actually what, unfortunately, the Perez government did, and Perez by himself did before the election, that made some kind of cautious among the Israeli and even among the Palestinian. He was kind of hesitant in his policy. He was reluctant to push forward the peace process, and even his campaign in south of Lebanon, actually I believe that gave him some incredible kind of a protest among the Palestinians themselves. That
now you're referring there to the military action taken against Hezbollah?
Yes, that's what that is before the election, maybe 2-3 weeks before the elections, and it didn't help him at all levels. I mean, it didn't help him within the Israeli, who actually they were kind of like reluctant to go with the Perez government, or hesitant, or they still they don't want to make any decision. He didn't win their position, and also he didn't win the position of those who are actually supporting the peace process, and they want to push the peace process forward. And he didn't actually also win the other side. So you see, so his kind of hesitant as a politician and as a government to push forward the peace process as was supposed to be, hurt Perez and hurt Perez in the election.
Now, there's been some arguments that perhaps he pushed a potential agreement with Syria that in some ways could have been more controversial than the ongoing negotiations with the Palestinians at the expense of the Palestinian peace process. Would you concur with that?
You mean that in what perspective you're talking about?
Well, in the sense that that he backed away from the political capital that he may have had after Rabin's assassination to perhaps move forward, speed up the withdrawal from the West Bank, accelerate the peace process with the Palestinians, and instead devoted his time to negotiations, trying to strike peace with Syria, possibly surrendering territory in the Golan Heights, which many Israelis may have had some discomfort with.
Well, I believe actually is that accelerating the peace process, especially taking the side of the Syrian, was a good move from Perez, because we cannot exclude the Syrian role in the Middle East. And it does not actually, if he made a strike of an agreement with the Syrian, that would help the Palestinian, that would help the peace process, that he is willing to go on for a peace, comprehensive peace in the
you're not
so
saying
it's not that's
not an either-or question.
Yes, I mean, I believe that's it was a positive side from Perez at that time, but as I told you before, that it's actually his hesitant to deploy the Israeli army from Hebron, and his hesitant to continue this with the Palestinian Authority. That's hurt Perez.
No, it's my
As like a credible kind of a person that would go along with the peace process, and that's why today, if you're asking an individual Palestinian, they will tell you, well, I mean, whenever you're talking about Perez or talking about Netanyahu, they are the same coin, the same face of the coin.
Mm-hmm.
So he at that time he should change that image among the Palestinians that he is different, that he is going to go ahead with the peace process, and he is willing to do that, you see.
Now, it's my understanding that in Hebron we're talking about an Arab population of approximately 64,000.
That's right.
And then the Israeli army staying in place to, in effect, protect approximately 450 settlers.
Yeah, I guess, yes, that's true. That's the case. I mean, this is, you're talking about the majority, the Arabs living there, and that's why Perez is reluctant to go ahead with this and withdraw the Israeli troop, made some kind of like suspicion among the Palestinian individuals, and that's what they were kind of suspicion about the whole peace process going to be continued, and did not help the Palestinian Authority. It did not help Yasser Arafat to give some kind of momentum among the Palestinian masses. You see what I mean? So maybe this is the case. Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
I have the impression we're really touching on a crucial issue here, this issue of land. I know in the press here, we read a lot or hear a lot about the people, these personalities, Netanyahu and Yasser Arafat.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, there is an important issue of land and who owns the land.
Uh-huh.
What is the future of all of this, and how does this relate to these particular personalities?
Well, the issue of personality, that's what's the media that they emphasize so much, not talking about the issue of the indigenous people. We're talking about the Palestinian who lived for thousands of years on that land. And those settlers who came later on and tried to occupy the land owned by the indigenous people, the Palestinians. So the issue is not who is Yasser Arafat and who is Netanyahu. We should talk a lot about actually the issue of the land, or how much the grassroots people who associated themselves with the land and how much that's important to them. And if you talk to any individual Palestinian who is living in a village, they will talk about their land. They're talking about the Israeli policy toward them, that confiscating their land and giving their land to the settlers. So this is a very important issue, and that the Palestinians at the individual level, I believe that they are willing to make a compromise. They are willing to live in peace with the Israelis, as much they believe that they have the security, that they are really still associated with their land, and still they having their land. Not anybody would like, to take this land out of their belonging. And this is something that we have missed to talk about it. And I think this is at the human level. You have to talk about how much this kind of association between an individual, the indigenous people, and the land that they live on.
You've said that ordinary Palestinians have expressed or seem to have some willingness to compromise a little,
Yes.
to acknowledge the right of Israel to
Yes.
exist. So is the hang-up that Israel is being too greedy and wanting too much land, or are the Palestinians not willing to compromise enough?
Well, actually, if you look at this situation, that at the ordinary Palestinian, ordinary kind of person, they have a feeling that the Israeli is so much greedy in order to expand their interest on behalf of what they own and what they live on. And that's any ordinary Palestinian, if you ask him, they have this kind of feeling, and they are afraid. And this is another thing that it has been missed about talking about the security. Security of what? Security of the man, of the person, of living on land and not being threatened in the future. Taking the land and has no future, what is going to do? And this is the thing. This is the security what we are talking about. It's not about the military security. It's not about the security that been emphasized by Netanyahu or other Israeli politicians. What we are talking about really is the security of the indigenous people, those individuals who are living in their villages, and they want to go on with their lives and to live peacefully with their neighbors, to live peacefully with the Israeli, and they are willing to do that. and they express that in their all the time.
What would the relationship between the average Palestinians that we've been talking about be to Arafat's government? And where are we with this with government in the context of the Palestinian Authority? Are we looking at a democracy? Are we looking at a fairly autocratic one-leader system? And what is the possibilities down the road for these Palestinians to have some voice in their future and some sense of the security that you say that they're looking for?
Well, Harvey, it's actually that what you are talking about is the style of the new Palestinian Authority headed by Yasser Arafat. Yes, there is some kind of autocratic style with the Yasser Arafat and his government, but if you take from historical perspective, I mean, the Palestinians, they're always supporting the PLO. They always supported Yasser Arafat and the other revolutionary leaders. And at the same time, and if you look at the PNC when it was in exile, it was actually following the democratic rule, and many being elected by the Palestinian masses, and as opposed to Yasser Arafat policy or the within the PNC.
Now, PNC
and
refers to
the Palestinian National Council, which is the kind of like the parliament of in exile. Now, when after the peace process, after the Oslo and the agreement signed by the Israeli, and during the first election in Palestine, the people's the Palestinian actually waived their decision, and they are supporting still Yasser Arafat and the authority, but still that they want some kind of a change in the style itself. But does not mean that there is no democracy. Actually, there was some kind of, you could see that they practice this democracy, and the Palestinians, they are practice this kind of democracy way of many years ago. So it's not new for the Palestinian. But definitely there is an opposition among the Palestinians to the style of Arafat's policy and the style of the Arafat's government policy. And you could hear it from many credible kind of Palestinian leaders, intellectuals, criticizing Yasser Arafat of what he's doing. But yet at the same time, they would argue what we want right now is a land and a state, and later on we could settle our differences. So for the Palestinian is actually the issue is now is the Palestinian state. Is the issue is that they do want having their own state, their own identity. So you see, despite those differences, and that despite that the Palestinian, they have this kind of attitude toward Yasser Arafat and his government. But in general, they are pushing toward peace. As I said before, any ordinary Palestinian, they would like just to live with peace with their neighbors, with the Israelis, and the only thing that what they are looking is that peace of mind, their own identity, and being in a state that they are struggling for many years. That's basically the objective of any indigenous people seeking for self-determination.
I'd like to return to Richard's earlier point about the land as being a central controversy here. On the one side, you have this tremendous religious attachment to the land, a sense of the land as being God-given. On the other, you have the Palestinian people indigenous to the area. You'll often hear many Israelis, even liberal Israelis, say that it's a particularly thorny issue because, in effect, you have two rights as opposed to a right and a wrong, or maybe two legitimate claims to the land. How do you see that conflict being resolved, or indeed can it?
Well, you describe it very well, Harvey. It is a thorny thing because claiming the legitimacy of owning the land, either from a biblical perspective, and that's hard to explain it. But let me just give you a very simple case. Okay. Say, for example, now I told you that I'm Palestinian, and my father and my uncles and my relatives, they used to own their houses in Haifa. So for many, many years, for thousands of years, and they had their own land, and they lost this land. So what's the argument would you give to those people? What kind of response can you give to my father or to my uncle or to my relatives that this land was not belong to you because it was belonged to the Israeli 3,000 years ago? I mean, does it make sense to you? So this is the kind of thing that we have to look at it, that many Palestinians lost their land based on the struggle, and the one who won the war won the land, you see. It's not a matter of to whom belonged this land from biblical perspective and go back like 3,000 or 4,000 years. I used to live I was born in a house, and my father born in that house, my grandfather born in that house, and it was actually owned by my father and my family, and we lost it during the war. So you think that we don't have the right for that house, for that property, for that land? And the same thing you can figure of the thousands and millions of Palestinians who lost their land and lost their houses. So I think that is very simple explanation for that. The rights and the justice should go to the right people, and having their right to own their houses and their land. And then I guarantee that, as I said, and always I stress on that, any ordinary Palestinian would be willing to compromise, would be willing just to live peacefully if that Palestinian feel that he's secured in that land and nothing threatening him in the future.
I mean, on the question of secure in the future, the other thing that occurs to me that might be thorny in this issue is the relationship, the capital-labor relationship between Israel and the Palestinian people. Isn't it true that a lot of the Palestinians work in Israel?
Well, you touch, Richard, a very important point also. That's the situation of the cheap labor, you can say that. I mean, this is something happening all over the third world, and we don't give some kind of like more study to this issue. And this is what's happening even within, whenever you look at the Palestinian-Israeli relationship, is that many Palestinians actually, they are living as a cheap labor, working as a cheap labor for the Israelis. And this is a case that we should take into consideration also.
And what kind of vision does the Palestinian leadership have for the future? Do they envision a capitalist Palestine or a socialist Palestine, and how would it relate to Israel?
Well, according to if you look at the historical perspective of what the PLO did, actually they were doing some kind of social welfare kind of a program. When they were in the exodus, in the exile in Lebanon or Tunisia, they do have their own grassroots organizations or welfare organization that helping the Palestinians. And I do have some kind of feeling that they might follow the same thing, but the issue here is how much the international community is willing to help the Palestinian Authority, the National Palestinian Authority, because, as you know, the whole infrastructure has been destroyed by the occupier, by the Israeli military. So they don't have now the basic infrastructure to go ahead and helping the Palestinians. So this is very critical issue. We have to look at it before, visualizing what kind of economic system we should follow.
Well, the reason I was asking is because this issue may be very important in Israeli politics. If they lose this source of cheap labor, what happens?
Oh, well, this is a good question. I mean, this is kind of like an incentive for some hard politician in Israel just to keep the flow of those cheap labor or the availability of this cheap labor. It's like in any capitalist system. So, but I don't think that's would be. It is a critical issue, but it depends so much on how much the National Palestinian Authority could flourish some kind of security or creating jobs for those Palestinians that they have no choice but seeking jobs in Israel and seeking jobs that are cheap jobs. I think that it depends so much on the side of the Palestinian government rather than the Israeli. Once you solve it, then I don't believe that could be an obstacle for bringing peace process toward more fulfillment among the Palestinian and the Israeli.
And does the Palestinian leadership have a plan for solving that problem, or are they simply relying on world assistance?
I believe they should start with a plan. I don't recollect that they do have a plan, but some of the intellectuals, they talk about it, they think about it, and it's a discussion among the Palestinian actually what kind of a system we are seeking, and really it's not. I believe, yes, I agree with you, Richard. It's not just only to depend on the international community like the World Bank, whatever, but at the same time, some kind of help from the international community could give a little bit, lift up the Palestinian National Authority to fulfill some of its, at least of its, promises for the Palestinian. That is, after the peace process, there's going to be security of jobs and so on. And if you ask any ordinary person, well, that's what ordinary person would concern about, having a very secure job in the future. So this is the issue, what we have to emphasize about, not the theoretical kind of looking what kind of economic system. And this dialogue, it may come later on after you build the infrastructure, or at least the basis for the infrastructure. That's my belief.
Okay, you're listening to Palestinian scholar and peace activist Amin Kazak. What I've read, the Oslo Accords, which initiated the peace process between the Palestinians and Israelis, has tended to benefit a certain technocratic elite within Israel that in process, but the benefits have not translated to all aspects of Israeli society, particularly Palestinians, Sephardic Jews, and other groups within Israel. Is it your sense that some of these class divisions may have contributed to the Netanyahu victory as well?
You are talking about from the Israeli side or the Palestinian side?
Of both.
Both? Well, I don't know. I mean, I cannot be very accurate regarding the Israeli side, but definitely I would emphasize about the Palestinian side. Definitely, after the peace process or after Oslo, certainly has created some kind of bureaucratic elites that they benefited from the peace process, and created some class division among the Palestinians themselves, and the ordinary Palestinian will tell you that. I mean, definitely about this issue, and this is another thing, another issue that we should look at it in order to. If we are looking for a successful peace process, this is one of the issues, Harvey, you're talking about, that's creating this kind of like credible Palestinian bureaucrat that benefited from the peace process. And that's what I mentioned that. Plus, in addition, what I have mentioned, the autocratic style of Yasser Arafat's and the government, the Palestinian government that's still going on. And this should be addressed by the Palestinian whenever any chance, in order to clear the way for every Palestinian to understand that this is a new era, this is a new kind of attitudes, and we should not continue the same way that many countries in the Middle East fallen into this kind of bureaucratic kind of situation. And I believe that's very unfortunate that this is the way what's happening. And I have heard that from many Palestinians, that they still criticizing the National Palestinian Authority, saying that, hey, they are doing the same thing like any other Arab country, kind of like bureaucrats, autocrats, and so on. So, yes, I think this is very important issue also, that we should address it and take it in consideration whenever we're talking about any potential for the success of the peace process between the Palestinian and the Israeli. And I believe the same thing would be the same issue among the Israeli themselves. But I cannot tell you from the Israeli side as much I can tell you now from the Palestinian side.
Okay, let's turn to another highly problematic area, and that's the outgroups to the peace process. On the Palestinian side, we'd have Hamas and Islamic Jihad. On the Israeli side, the ultra-Orthodox religious settlers on the West Bank. Can these groups be incorporated into the peace process? Are they going to continue to be a serious danger to it? And as Americans from our own media, do we have a correct perception of groups such as Hamas?
Well, you touch another important issue, that whenever we talk about the obstacles to peace, we jump into the conclusion about some groups, and especially the Hamas or the Islamists, and most of the time, and maybe all the time, they've been stereotyped, those Islamist movement, and basically what you are talking about, Hamas, as being terrorist. And this is one of the mistakes that our media all the time doing this, not just only for Hamas, for any group, Islamist group in the Middle East, and stereotyping the whole organization or the whole people who believe in the Islamic value as being terrorists. This is wrong. And because within the group themselves, you could find different groups, those who are ready to make a compromise, those who are more radical, more hawkish, more whatever you can call it. Same thing with the Irish movement, for example. I mean, you find Gerry Adams and you find some others who oppose to Gerry Adams. So you cannot brush with one brush of the whole organization and say they are terrorists. Because there are some groups, they are willing to make a consensus, they are willing to incorporate it into the peace process, and they have a different methodology. So we have to look at the methodology, not what they believe. And unfortunately, we don't talk about their belief. Their belief is about Islam. And they believe that whenever any state is going to be in the future, it's going to be according to the Islamic Sharia. And this is many, not only some Palestinians, but also many peoples in the Middle East. So what we have to look at the methodology, actually, and not brushing all the organization with one kind of like, picture, same picture, and stereotyping picture that we used to have about the Islamists. And if you are talking even ordinary individual in the Middle East, not just among the Palestinians, they are really upset about this kind of stereotype about the Islamists, because it's actually a stereotype about Islam rather than the Islamists, rather than the organization. You see my point?
Yes, but I mean, the situation is complicated because the Palestinian Authority, for the most part, is secular,
No.
where these organizations are more religious, and therefore there is not unity among the Palestinians. Is that the actual issue from the Palestinian side?
I understand, Richard. Even the term secularism kind of like kind of vague in the Middle East among the individual, because every individual, whether that person is a Christian or a Muslim, is a part. The religion is a part of their tradition, is a part of their values, and even those they proclaim they are or claim they are seculars, but basically they follow the traditional value of their society. And we are talking about, I remember in the 50s and the 60s, of those hardcore nationalists, and talking about being secular, but at the same time they were practicing the traditional values or following the traditional values of their society, whether they are Christian, whether they are Muslim, or they are Jewish. So we should separate a little bit or misunderstand the word secularism from the Western perspective and the Middle Eastern perspective. So this is very important issue. And those that they live their religion, but they are actually maybe not necessarily agree with the Islamists, especially the militant Islamists, but at the same time, they are so much associated with their Islamic value. So, and maybe they call them, you can call them maybe secular at that point, but so that's maybe another word, another perspective, or another issue that should be addressed among the intellectuals here.
But is that a point of conflict among the Palestinian people, between supporters of the PLO and supporters of Hamas, for example?
Well, it's not a matter of it's not a matter of conflict. It's a matter of conflict over methodology. I mean, many Palestinians, even those very Islamist in their ideas, maybe they disagree with the Hamas. As I told you that even within Hamas themselves, they disagree about some kind of like, the methodology of some of the group within Hamas, what they are doing. And at the same time, many those, they consider themselves, even at your perspective, Richard, that being secular, they are disagreeing with Yasser Arafat, being very autocratic, kind of like a person, and so on. So the whole thing is the methodology. How kind of approach the peace process? How can we make a reconciliation with the Israelis?
So for the most part, you're saying that the Palestinian people are fairly agreed on their goals.
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
a matter of how to get there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that's the goal, that's the objective. The Palestinian, they are willing to making reconcile with the Israelis based on what I have mentioned before, that to secure their own, their existence as being a Palestinian people, to secure their future, and to reach their goal of self-determination, of having their own state. That's the goal of all the Palestinians. Now, if you are talking about the methodology, there's something else.
How much unity? You said that there's not much unity in Hamas. How much control, say, if there's a political conciliatory side to Hamas, how much control do they have over those that are willing to set a bomb off in a crowd of civilians? And what would be the perception of Palestinians in general towards the terror campaign that seemed to grip Israel prior to the election?
Well, Harvey, actually, I didn't say there is no unity among the Hamas, but what I suggested that there are some disagreement about certain methodology of what's the best approach, being opposing to Yasser Arafat's policy, but they are, in general, as an objective, they are willing to create peace, and they are willing to some extent to reconcile to certain issues. But if you are talking about certain groups living on the fringe of this organization, I mean, you cannot control every individual. There are all over, whatever, I mean, the history will telling us about those very hardcore, radical, or zealous that you cannot control them. So we should not emphasize so much on those very small group rather than to look at the whole picture in order to make our own assessment or our own judgment about an organization. They believe in a certain ideology. You might agree or disagree with that ideology, but it's kind of their belief. I mean, they disagree with Yasser Arafat and his secular, whatever you call it, secular national authority, but they do have their own kind of values. They believe in it for the future of the Palestinian state. And I think that there's some kind of dialogue should be open between Yasser Arafat and his government and the Hamas. And even the Israeli themselves, they could open this dialogue with the Hamas in order, what do they want? I mean, this kind of thing, rather than, as I said, stereotyping all of them as being terrorists.
What is the crux of Palestinian of those Palestinians that object to the peace process? Is it primarily from the standpoint that you talked about earlier, that they would much prefer to see a separate Islamic state? Is it other issues that would?
Well, yeah, I would say that yes, they are looking for a very separate kind of like Islamic state, following the Islamic Sharia. This is what they believe. This is what their objective. This is their goal.
Okay, could you clarify maybe for our listeners what that type of state might look like?
Well, it's based on the Islamic Sharia. I mean, it's like the same.
Well, I might interject here that Sharia is the interpretation of the Quran as applied after the time of the Prophet.
Yeah, I mean, this Sharia is what you could say the Islamic law. Okay, so it's following the Quran and the Word of God, and it's for the Muslim, not just only for the Hamas or those Islamists, for any Muslim in the world, Islamic world. The Quran represents that's kind of the constitution of the Muslims, and that you should, and it follows that economic system or social system or welfare system. It's whole and whole. It's kind of like a system. This is the way they believe. Whether the other Palestinian or secular disagree with that or agree with that, this is another issue. But it's basically it's the methodology, and some of the methodology that been followed by Hamas was rejected by many Palestinians, like bombing those, which is, I mean, not acceptable for the Palestinian. And you can previously, I mean, there are many demonstrated Palestinians that disagree with this kind of policy, but does not mean they disagree with what the Islamists saying about the Sharia. They agree with them, but they disagree with their methodology, and that's basically among all the Muslims in the Islamic world. So we have to separate religion, Islam as a religion, even as a way of life, as a constitution for the Muslims, and those militants who are using the Islam as a way in order to reach their own objective, especially those who lived at the fringe of the society. Whether this is what's happening in Algeria, this is what's happening in Egypt. I'm talking about those extremists and following this kind of methodology that's not acceptable by the Muslims as a whole and all over the Islamic world.
Okay, assuming that the peace process has some fruition, that we either see an independent Palestinian state or a highly autonomous region. I mean, could we anticipate that level of conflict that we're seeing in Egypt, in Algeria, within a Palestinian?
Well, this is a good question. This depends on the future Palestinian government, how to deal with the opposition. I mean, with the Islamists, whatever. And I believe that the Algerian government made a big mistake with the Islamists, especially when they won the election at that time through a very democratic process that we hailed this process in the West. once they won the election, the Islamists, the Algerian, that's you know what's happened later on, and dismantle all the policy and wave a campaign against the Islamists that turned those many Islamists as martyrs in the eyes of many followers. The same thing in Egypt. I mean, you have to criticize the Egyptian government rather than this. I think it's the way, the methodology that you have to follow, and I anticipate that any Palestinian government in the future should take that into consideration, the way that they should deal with the whenever who wins the election. I mean, this is the game of democracy, right?
Well, let's get back to that question, because I think that's really important,
Mm-hmm.
and it ties into this question about what the nature of the economic structure of a future Palestinian state would be, because Sharia is a very variable thing. It depends on who you're talking to,
Mm-hmm.
what they say Sharia is, and
Yeah.
what it means for government and for economics.
Uh-huh.
Because certainly there are right-wing interpretations of Sharia and there are left-wing interpretations of Sharia.
Yes.
And people in Egypt in the 1960s were constructing Islamic states that were socialist.
Yes.
And today the Islamic movements are very reactionary.
Uh-huh.
That's an important question.
Oh,
and
yes.
and the Palestinian people are going to have to come to some sort of consensus amongst themselves if they're going to found a state, because otherwise the whole thing is just going to disintegrate into chaos. And unfortunately, I think that very argument is used by the Israeli government to justify its paternal
Mm-hmm.
relationship with the Palestinian territories.
Yeah, well, it depends the way that you explain the Sharia itself. I mean, you can use any ideology and make your own interpretation the way you want it. But the Sharia itself, if it is follows as it is, and this is historically, I'm talking about, it's socially acceptable to the thinking, even to the far left, because it creates some kind of social justice and equality among the masses. It's a kind of like, and it's this has been followed by many reformers, Islamic, during the Ottoman Empire, seeking for kind of equality within the Ottoman Empire among those who are Islamists, and they call themselves reformers. So if you are following the Sharia, you could follow the same of those leaders. They call themselves reformers, and that is creating a social justice. And but unfortunately, some of the Islamists who following or seeking the goal of the applying the Sharia, to some extent, as you mentioned, they are very retroactive, kind of backing backward rather than forward, and that's maybe I think that's an important point. But I have a sense that is some of the I think the activists within the Islamists, they do actually preaches or looking for this kind of the social justice within the Islamic law, and how can we apply it? Because like any other government today that claiming they are Islamists, those scholars, they would argue they are not following the right Islamic Sharia that been used during the first episode of the Islamic State during Prophet Muhammad and later on. So maybe this is another point, that you cannot just whenever you say, well, this is a country following Islam or the Sharia, does not mean necessarily they are following really the context of the Sharia itself.
Well, and what are Palestinians going to do about this dichotomy?
Well, this is up to them to decide. I mean, in a democratic process, it's up to the Palestinian to, participate in the election and decide what kind of economic system, what kind of a system in the future we need. And yes, I should emphasize that this is one of the issues should be addressed even like a kind of like within any election, like a campaigning. What kind of a system we are seeking about. I mean,
Well, okay, and I want to push you on this a little bit because you said earlier that a lot of people want to put off these questions until a state is founded and until an infrastructure starts developing. And I would submit that none of those things can happen until this very question is solved.
Well, this is the case. I mean, I'm just responding to this question. I should go back to what I've said. Yes, now, what the Palestinians are pushing now is, and this is, if you ask any ordinary person, I'm not talking about the higher level or the intellectual level or whatever, that really what they want is, let's have a state now. Let's have our own self-determination right now, and then we'll talk about whatever the issues. It's a dilemma, but it's kind of thing that we have been caught after so many years of occupation and after so many years of destruction, and after many years of despair among the Palestinians. So this is the kind of thing that we should a little bit hold off a little bit about it, and then later talk about it later on. Just give a chance for the ordinary Palestinian that just to breathe the kind of freedom that they could enjoy in this future.
But at the same time, a capitalist class is being developed among the Palestinians as a result of the Oslo Accords. Isn't that in and of itself a threat to the peace process because it's dividing the Palestinians?
Well, not in a sense dividing the Palestinians, but yes, in a sense that creating some kind of frustration among the individual, that we don't need the same bureaucrats, same kind of like that's happening in many countries in the Middle East. It's a dilemma. I mean, and to be honest with you, Richard, I have no question. I have no answer about that, because it's really a dilemma that not facing the Palestinian, but facing all the liberation movement. Look what's happening in South Africa today. Same thing. I think you can address the same question to Mandela's government. I mean, the people at the beginning, they were so much like in euphoria. I mean, because they want that kind of to get rid of the apartheid, right? And the same thing, it's the Palestinians, they are living in a kind of, in a situation that, let's talk now about today, okay? And then we think about the future. But I think that you have raised a very, very important question, a very important issue that should be addressed in any kind of discussion about the future of the Palestinian Israeli peace process, and especially for the Palestinians themselves. But as I told you, that as much as happened to many liberation movements, this is what happened to them all the time, that what kind of a system, and that's the dialogue or the kind of, created some kind of conflict within the movement itself and destroyed the whole thing. So we should approach this in a different fashion, and this is what I believe. I mean, I agree with you 100% regarding this issue, but we should approach in a different fashion that we get used to, like opening the discussion what kind of a system we need right now, you see. We have to be very cautious at the beginning, and I don't guarantee what's going to happen, whether that can we get rid of those bureaucrat kind of like elites that being created by the peace process or not. I don't know. I have no answer for that.
Okay, well, and you make a good point by comparing the situation with South Africa, because I think that's exactly what's happened lately in South Africa, is that the ANC compromised some of its ideals in order to govern, and it's true among progressive movements in this country also. But at the same time, it strikes me that by giving up the ideological issue, we're playing on the other side's turf.
Yes.
And therefore, can never win because it's their game on their home court.
Yeah, but Richard, I mean, there is no just either this way or that way. I mean, that's the dilemma that we start thinking about it now today whenever we're talking about whether to be a rebellion and kind of like rejecting whatever it is, or compromiser. I mean, there is either this way or there is no such thing. And I believe that every situation and every case has its own characteristics. I mean, even when I mentioned South Africa, I believe that the Palestinian case could be different than South Africa. So I think that we have to look very deeply into the Palestinian case in order to give a right answer for your question.
Thank you, Amin. And you've been listening to Professor Amin Kazak, a Palestinian scholar and peace activist, on this edition of Hemispheres.
Thank you.
And thank you.